Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Backwards Marathon. This is Josh Ronquist here, and I'm pretty tired right now. I'm feeling pretty not good mentally right now, so what a better time to talk about one of my favorite bands of all time, who touches so much on mental health, love, loss, and everything in between, a band known as Anathema. Sadly, the band broke up just a couple years ago, back in 2020, and the band had a 30-year career, starting with the album Serenades that officially came out in 1993, which, now that I think about it, is 30 years since it came out. Time flies by too fast, doesn't it? And ending with their last album, The Optimist. And what a change in the band that has happened on almost every single album. You start off with gothic death doom, and you end with more experimental alternative rock. And in between there, you got more of the goth rock, a little bit of industrial, a lot of prog, some more experimentation with electronics. There is an era of Anathema for everybody, no matter your style of heavy music. And of course, what I do here with Backwards Marathon is I start from the beginning, and then I go to the end, and since Anathema is finite and not continuing, I am able to do the whole discography in my humblest of opinions. So let's get into it with the aforementioned Serenades. And this is legendary death doom. When you think of death doom, you think of bands like My Dying Bride, Paradise Lost, Catatonia, and Anathema is of course one of those bands as well. This is the only album that doesn't feature Vincent Cavanagh on vocals, so it's a little bit strange to hear it back that way, but I also think it really fits because this really shows where the band wanted to be at the time. And I think it still tremendously holds up. I don't think it's the best Death Doom album that they put out, but of the two, I would happily give it the silver medal. And with that said, yeah, I'm gonna give it a C. Next up is the Silent Enigma, the second last Death Doom album that the band has put out. Second and last Death Doom album, my apologies, and also the first to feature vocals from Vincent Cavanagh. And this feels like it's the real start of what Anathema should be. Of course, it is still layered in that Death Doom, but you actually start to hear more clean vocals this time around. You start to hear a little bit more of the experimentation that goes on in Death Doom from time to time, and you can really see that the band wants to break away from Death Doom on this album as well, which is strange because it is so thick with it. It almost feels like this is the first true album from Anathema, despite that not being the case, but it feels like everything started coming into place with this album, and it is an album that is so much fun to be able to go back to, and I say that of course being a Death Doom, Funeral Doom, Doom fan. So if you enjoy sad music like I do, of course this is something that's very fun and enjoyable. If you get really sad and you get emotional during these albums, it can be very cathartic as well. And that's what I mainly gravitated towards. I get very emotional when I listen to Anathema with all of their albums, and yeah, I think this is a perfect example of the heaviest side of Anathema, not necessarily lyrically, but at least musically. And I think with that, I have to give it a B. Following that, we got Eternity, which is where the Death Doom completely goes away, just like I talked about. The first two albums really do show off the Death Doom, but Eternity starts to show off more of the gothic side. It starts to show more of the alternative side. It's like a goth metal, alternative metal, gothic rock, alternative rock album. It's very, very dark, and you can hear, especially through all eras of Anathema, the lyrical concepts never stop being heavy, and if you let yourself, you'll be able to get emotionally teared up, if not physically teared up, every time that you listen to one of their albums. Something can really strike you, and yeah, Enigma is a perfect example of that. While I don't think it's the most fine-tuned for what they were trying to do in the alternative state, I think it was a great start, and I think it was a good choice to be able to go in this direction because it led to some of my favorite albums from the band. So yeah, with that said, I think I am going to give it a C. Now, again, I have to clarify this every single time. You might see me just throwing it on the list in the ranked order, and yeah, for the individual letter, they are where I want them to be, but at the very end, I'll change them and put them in the exact order that I want them to be in. So with that said, let's go into the fourth album from Anathema, Alternative 4. which not only is a better representation of where the band wanted to be at, it also spun off when John decided to leave the band and he created a band called Alternative 4, which really stuck to this style and did a magnificent job with it. With Alternative 4, I would like to think that they really started to figure out the direction that the band wanted to go in, and even with this, not sticking to the style that they would be going into with later albums, it's a good representation of where the band was at the time. The songs started getting a lot stronger, the production started getting a lot stronger as well. Of course, Vincent's voice just got incredible during this album, and you can really start to hear him really finding his sound. Danny, of course, one of the greatest musicians of all the styles that he's ever been a part of, and such a magnificent songwriter, no matter the style, whether it's death doom, whether it's more electronic, he's always able to find something that you can gravitate towards on the guitar, and especially on Alternative 4, you can start to really feel the emotion of what he could do on the guitar. And it's so great to see that it was going in this direction. It's not the album that I go back to the most, but it is an album that I truly, truly love. And yeah, I think I'm gonna put this as a B as well. Coming up now is arguably the band's best album, and that is, of course, Judgement. This is what I feel like was the culmination of what the band was trying to do ever since they stopped doing death doom. They wanted to be able to make that perfect blend of gothic and alternative with just the right amount of pop sensibility, with the right amount of guitar solos, with everything that just feels right. It feels like a concept album, even though it's not a concept album all the way through. I mean, especially the first half of the album feels like it's so connected together and it just flows right into each other. The latter half doesn't really do that, and I don't think it really needed to as well. It feels like it's telling some great stories, few and far between, but they're telling great stories through here. And of course, one of the greatest songs ever written, One Last Goodbye, is on this album. And if you've ever lost a loved one, especially a parent, this song will hit you right there. The production on this album feels a little bit raw compared to what would be on latter albums, but I feel like it is perfect for the storytelling and the musicianship that's going on here, for the story that they wanted to tell musically. Everything about this album just feels right. And with that said, yeah, I don't think this is going to surprise anybody. I have to put this at an S. A Fine Day to Exit is next, and this is an album that I honestly have a hard time getting into. I don't like saying that. I don't like saying that about any Anathema albums, but this one does have some songs that I do enjoy, but I honestly feel like the band was still just trying to figure out what to do after Judgement, because after you make a masterpiece like that, you can't make Judgement Part 2. You gotta create something different. And that's what they tried to do with A Fine Day to Exit. It's a concept album, which I truly appreciate, but I guess just for me, it just doesn't flow together as much as I wanted it to. And, you know, especially for the hardcore Anathema fans, this is a classic and seminal album for the band. But for me personally, I think it just leans a little too far into the alternative route for my taste. It almost goes indie rock, which is not really my bag. Baby. I'm only doing this in regards to the whole band's discography. I'm gonna put A Fine Day to Exit at D. A Natural Disaster is up next, and it was the last album before a much needed break for the band. The band came back very, very strong in the latter half of their career, but they really felt like this was an album where they decided to go a little bit proggier. Of course, I think it was a more refined version of what they were trying to do on A Fine Day to Exit. It's not a perfect album, but the songs that are on here that are perfect are stellar, and some of the best music that you're gonna hear in their style. And yeah, kind of like I mentioned before, it has a lot of alternative moments on here. There's some bluesy moments that go on, proggy moments, just a little bit, not as much as they were gonna be hitting into, especially in the last portion of their career. But yeah, I think it is a better version of what they were trying to do with A Fine Day to Exit, and a great closing of what would be the second chapter of Anathema. So with that said, yeah, I think, in all fairness, I'm going to give this a C. Then, coming back after a much needed break, only a few years, but it was a break nonetheless that the band needed to take. They came back with a newer lineup. They decided that they wanted to go into a more emotional, progressive style, and it's my favorite era of the band in general. Yes, we started off with the legendary album We're Here, Because We're Here. An album title that's a little hard to say. I mean, you try saying it 3 times fast without screwing up somewhere. But it is an album that is the album that I first heard Anathema on. I heard everyone going crazy about this in the forum regions that I lived when this album came out, and it wasn't for me at first. When I first heard it, it just didn't do much for me, and I was really sad to see that because I wanted to really feel it. Then I realized my biggest downfall. I bought the album digitally, and when I did not put it onto iTunes, I did not buy it from iTunes, I bought it separately, and I made the very dumb mistake of putting the songs in alphabetical order, not the track order of the album. I didn't realize this until after Weather Systems came out. That's how terrible I was. But once I finally put it in the track order, everything clicked. Everything made so much sense. And I was so happy to finally be able to appreciate this album because it really is a magnificent, emotional, progressive masterpiece. I love everything about this album. We're Here Because We're Here. It doesn't have the grand conceptual feel. It doesn't have the great epic grandiose feel that Weather Systems have. It's shorter, it's sweeter, the songs are shorter, everything starts to make a lot more sense during this time, and you can see that the band is going to take a giant step forward in that progressive route. But yeah, all of that said, I'm so glad I was able to start appreciating this album. Easily an A. Next up is what could be the best Anathema album, Weather Systems. This is the album that I cried so hard when I heard the first 2 songs off this album. And if you listen to it, you'll understand why. Case in point, relationships. This album is so much about relationships and about letting go, whether it's because of death, whether it's because both parties decide that they need to move on, and everything in between, and all of the feelings that come between that, and it hits such great emotional strides throughout the entire album, and you start to feel so many emotions through here. Sadness, joy, anger, love, despair, everything is shown off on this album, and it's weird to say that as well because this is the perfect example of how an album can tear you down, but it's one of the most cathartic feelings you'll ever feel because it's feelings that everyone can deal with. Sometimes they've never heard it in a song like this. If you're just into pop music and you think like Adele is just like the quintessential sad artist, I defy you to check out Weather Systems by Anathema and see if you don't tear up just as much as your precious Adele. We'll see what happens. But in all seriousness, this is the best album that they came up with in the last half of their being. And I'm so happy that I got to see the band for the first time during this album cycle. Although unfortunately for me, I got very, very sick before the tour started. I was starting to feel a little bit better, and those were the last 2 interviews that I did in 2012 was Danny of Anathema and Nij of Alcest. I wasn't able to do another one again until 2014 once I started to recover. But all of that said, this was a perfect note to end on, a perfect album from this magnificent band, and I don't think it's going to surprise anybody that I'm going to be throwing this up as an S as well. Distant Satellites. Now, the reason I brought up the fact that I interviewed Danny from Anathema is because we talked about this album in such great detail, but nobody saw it until after the fact that the press release and other interviews started to come out talking about Distant Satellites. I knew all about this album before everyone else did, and it broke my heart that people didn't check out that interview at the time. Of course, it's gone on and more people have checked it out, but we go into detail about how you take the emotion of Weather Systems and you start to mess with it musically. Of course, there's great orchestral, progressive moments. I mean, everything that goes on, especially in the beginning moments of this album, the Lost Song, it tears you apart musically, and I choke up every time that I hear that. This album also has the self-titled song for the band, Anathema. And the title track is a song that normally is not in my wheelhouse because this is very much like focused on electric drums. It kind of feels like a lo-fi kind of rave kind of thing. Like it really starts to feel like the band is experimenting more with electronica on the second half of this album, which again we talk about in the interview. And when I heard him talk about it, I was very intrigued, but especially at the time, I didn't know if I was going to enjoy it because, you know, I was very much a stickler, and I really just stuck to either prog music especially in 2013, but I am so glad in 2014 that I gave this album a chance because it's gorgeous. From beginning to end, every single song works so perfectly, and I hate saying it, it's the last fantastic Anathema album. I love this album to death. I'm glad I got to see them for the second and final time at Prog Power in 2016, and I didn't realize that was going to be the last time I was going to see them. I would have appreciated the show just a little bit more, but I was so glad to be able to hear songs off of this album in a live setting. But yeah, with all of that said, I have to give Distant Satellites an A. We end with the most ironic album of the band's discography, The Optimist. Not only a sequel to A Fine Day to Exit, but also an album that, again, conceptually goes along with what happens in A Fine Day to Exit, but also where the band pretty much broke. I kind of realized it at the time, especially when I talked to Danny, because I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to him, but the album released months before the release date when someone leaked it. And instead of being able to talk about the album, during the whole interview, he just went off about how upset he was that no one got to check out the album when it was supposed to be released, and it was stolen from them. Money was stolen from them, and I feel like it really broke Danny. And unfortunately, he's been battling mental demons just like I have. I mean, it was just last year that he tried to take his life, and I know all about that, having tried that 9 times in my life as well. And of course, after the release of this album, the band did implode. And when the band did implode, in 2020, it was announced that Weather Systems, a spiritual successor to Anathema, was going to be starting up. It has some of the members of Anathema. It feels like Danny and Vincent just aren't going to be working together anymore, which I feel is heartbreaking. But it's great to see that Danny is going through with it. I'm glad that he was able to at least start to get the help that he needs, and I'm so very excited to see where Weather Systems, the band, is going to be continuing. But as far as The Optimist, I mean, maybe I'm just leaning a little too much into it because of all of the bad that came along with it and just like seeing how much it tore down Danny. Just musically, it didn't hit me the way that like Distant Satellites did, because I feel like Distant Satellites was that perfect way to be able to combine progressive, gothic, electronic music together, where I feel like The Optimist was a bit more of that modern day A Fine Day to Exit, which again, just isn't my bag. So if you haven't guessed, The Optimist is along that same way, and again, we're just seeing the band implode and knowing that this was the final album from Anathema, I just feel bad talking about it, but it's the realistic thing that comes along with it. So I think with that, I sadly have to say it. The Optimist is also a D. Now that I talked about all the albums, I'm going to take a couple minutes to be able to rearrange the albums in the way that I feel they deserve to be put in. So I'm going to snap my fingers, and I'll be right back. And we're back, and as you can see here, I got everything in the order that I want it to be in, and it was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. Let's start from the bottom, from what I feel is the weakest album, all the way to what might be the best album. Oh, look, I just had to change things again, and it might change again before we get to the S rank. But starting with that, at the bottom level, at D, I have The Optimist, and then A Fine Day to Exit. At C, we have Serenades, Eternity, and A Natural Disaster. At B, we have The Silent Enigma, and then Alternative 4. At A, we have Distant Satellites, and then We're Here Because We're Here. And finally, this is actually harder than I thought it could be. I feel like Judgement could be the best album. I feel like Weather Systems could be the best album. But I'm going to leave it like this. Judgement, starting off the S rank, and the top album from Anathema, Weather Systems. Thank you much for being able to check out another edition of Backwards Marathon. If you liked what I did, if you hate what I did, and if you want to tell me how wrong I am for my own personal choices, leave me a comment down below. But also like or dislike, share the video, subscribe. I guess that notification bell is important, so if you want to see when I put stuff up, go ahead and click that. It makes things a little bit easier. And until my next interview, review, Backwards Marathon, or list, this is Josh Runquist for Heavy Debriefings saying, see ya.